If you've just started making music and don't play an instrument, I know that constructing chords can sometimes feel like picking notes at random. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cover the bare minimum amount of music theory to help you identify and name chords, give you an overview of common chord types, and I'll also touch briefly on how certain chords function relative to each other. So right now I have my project file set to the A minor scale, which is functionally the same as the C major scale. And this will highlight all of the notes within scale to kind of give you a bit of a frame of reference for some of what I'm talking about. All right, so here we have an A minor chord. Let's understand what makes this an A chord and also what gives it that minor sound. So first things first, chords, at least within our more Western music tradition, we typically construct chords by stacking notes with gaps of either 2 piano keys between them or 3 piano keys. These intervals are what we would call thirds. Now, the reason why they're called thirds is because within our scale, this would be the first note, this would be the second note, and this would be the third note. So we have this interval of a third in terms of the scale at the very least. And same applies to this third up here. If we treat this as our first note, this is our second note, this is our third. So that's where that name comes from. Even if we have a chord that starts on a different part of the scale, so let's say B, which in our A minor scale would be the second, we would still call this gap of 2 piano keys in between a third because relative to the B, we're going 1, 2, 3. If you've constructed chords with note gaps larger or smaller than these 2 or 3 gaps, don't worry, I'll explain how that fits into this system later and how we would recognize what chords those are. Now, when we have this gap of 2 right here, we would call this a minor third. And this is sort of the basis for any minor chord. And it has that sort of, more negative tonality. Whereas if I were to move this up 1, now we have, here, let me change this over to A major. So in the A major scale, we have, starting from the root note, this gap of 3. And now we have what was once a minor sound into a very major sound. Now switching back to minor for a moment. In short, 2-note gap, that's a minor third. 3-note gap, that's a major third. Chords are typically made up of more than just 2 notes, however. This third note in the chord is what we would call a fifth, since it's the 5th note within the scale starting at the root note. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Putting the scale aside for a second, this will almost always be a 6-note gap between the root and the 5th. So by note, I mean relative to the piano keys. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In terms of scale, though, it's just the 5th. An easier way to think about it, though, is that if the bottom third is minor, so in this case, this 2-note gap, that top third in this chord is almost always going to be major, and vice versa. So if I raise this back up so that we have this major third here, then we have this minor third at the top. However, unlike this third here at the bottom of the chord, this note doesn't really have any effect on the chord's tonality. So if I remove it and play this, it still sounds minor. And with it, even though we have this major third up here, still sounds minor. That's because our ears aren't hearing this relative to the note directly below it. We're actually hearing, in this case, this E relative to the A. So while this shift here gives us that kind of defining tonality of the chord, this note only really serves to add some extra body to the chord. And generally with more complicated chords with a lot more notes, it's one of the first notes to get removed because it doesn't really contribute anything super meaningful to the sort of tonality of that chord. Now, let's talk about inversions for a moment. So let's say we have a chord that looks like G, C, and E. So here you see we have this 4-note gap rather than a 2-note or 3-note gap. And while this G is on the bottom and you might be inclined to call this a G chord because of that, it's actually not the case, because this does still fit within our 2-note, 3-note gap structure that we build chords off of. So if we take this G note here, move it an octave up, you see that we have this exact same structure of this major third, minor third. And then now we can see that this is in fact a C major chord with this major third on the bottom, and it sounds very major. Now you can take this a step further, and rather than having just this one note that you would have to move back up to the top, you could move this E down here. This would be what's called second inversion. So if you'd have one note move to the bottom of the chord, that would be what you would call a first inversion. This is a second inversion. Now, even though we have this minor third here, which on its own sounds pretty like, it sounds minor. If we put the C back in here on the top, it still sounds like a C major chord. See, it's a lot more happy now, for lack of a better term, and that's because we're still hearing this C as the root note, as if it were down here. All right, that covers the way that we would identify whether a chord is major and minor, and what that root note of the chord is. Now we'll jump into some more flavorful chord types for you to sort of play around with and see what you can come up with. Basically a way to give your chords more flavor than just being like, you know, generally positive and generally negative. Now, the simplest way to start spicing up your chords is to just add another third to the top. So naturally within our A minor scale, we can add this G to the top. So now we have 4 separate notes in our chord. And you'll hear, relative to the A minor chord, that has much more of a sort of, I would call it a bittersweet sound, or like almost kind of hopeful. Basically, by adding this third on top, it sort of tempers that generally negative tonality without changing it completely. So you have this contrast that makes it, I mean, it sounds more complicated, kind of emotionally as well as harmonically. On the flip side, we can actually make this a major chord. So moving back to the A major scale, I'm going to move this C up to fit in the scale. And I'll also move this note up to fit in the scale. So we have this very major sounding chord with our A major, and that's A major 7. So this note being the 7th note of the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This sort of has a similar vibe as the A minor 7 chord, where it just is tempering that main kind of emotional feel to make it feel more complicated and less purely positive or less purely negative. Now, one other type of 7th chord that you'll see more often than the other two, if anything, is just called a dominant 7 chord. And that's using this major chord base, but then rather than going major, minor, major in terms of your note intervals, we're actually going major, minor, minor. One quick thing here to note is that in both the major and minor scale, this particular group of notes only shows up naturally in one place, or this particular group of intervals, I mean. Now, despite that, this is probably the most common 7th chord that you'll hear. And that's because once you start getting up into these upper notes in any given chord, sticking strictly to the key becomes a lot less necessary. Now, if you're pulling a chord that is almost completely out of left field, the root note isn't in scale, that can be pretty jarring. Sometimes it works with the right setup, but it's not always going to sound very satisfying. It can just catch you off guard. Now, when you're adding these upper notes to a chord, though, it matters less and less the higher up you go. So you can sort of just play around with using whatever notes you want, and ignoring the actual scale to a point. So to backtrack a little bit, like I mentioned before, this is what's called a dominant seventh chord, or if somebody says 7 chord, this is probably what they're referring to if they don't specify major or minor. And you'll hear it still maintains a very similar vibe to that major chord. It doesn't heavily shift that tonality, more major or minor or anything like that, but it makes it more restless and kind of higher energy, and it really wants to push you forward along to the next chord. You can build seventh chords with other intervals, but these are the most common ones you'll typically see. As a bonus, I can show you the James Bond chord, if you will, which is called a minor major 7th chord. So you've got this minor interval at the bottom, you've got this fifth here, which you don't really worry about, and then we've got this major interval up here, and that can sound pretty intense, but it does really kind of have a mysterious sound to it. And that's kind of why it's used in, mysteries and stuff like that. Very, very common in like old James Bond movies. Now, you can keep stacking thirds on top to get even more complex chords. So like a 9th chord here and an 11th chord, which all at once can sound a little intense, but especially when you've got this many chords, sometimes it's nice to delay some of the notes so it doesn't hit you all at once. And that can sound really, really pretty. And when you're working with really big chords like this, you can start to cut out pieces of it. So like I mentioned before, the 5th is often one of the first ones to go. And hell, I might even drop the 7th and keep the 9th here. And that sounds fine, though. I think I'm sorry, I said 7th. I got rid of the 9th and kept the 11th. That's what I meant. I'm gonna add the 9th back in. Yeah, that's really nice. One thing to be careful, though, when working with really big chords like this, is that inversions can start to sound really bad. So if I bring this B note down here with the rest of our notes, you see that these notes are right next to each other. Hell, let's bring this G down as well and bring the D down, and this sounds not very good. It's very muddy. So when you're doing these really big chords, you kind of need to space out the notes a lot. And as I mentioned before, you kind of want them to be in this sort of higher range because that implies that they're an upper extension of the chord rather than something more foundational. And that makes it a lot nicer on the ears and especially a lot easier to parse. All right, now just as you can swap out major and minor thirds within a 7th chord, or like a 9th or 11th chord, you can also do that same thing with a normal 3-note chord. So if we go A, C, D sharp, or I guess E flat might be a better way of thinking of it, with these 2 minor thirds, we get what's called a diminished chord, which sounds very tense. And you generally don't want to stay there too long, but sometimes it's nice to kind of stew in that tension before resolving. So in the minor scale, we naturally have this diminished chord that as you'll hear, kind of wants to naturally resolve down to that root chord of our scale, the A minor. It's a very satisfying resolution because it lets you kind of hold on to that tension for a moment and then releases it. Now, we can also do something similar if we move back over to major. We can do a major third with another major third on top. Now, this also naturally wants to resolve down to our normal A minor, but in this case, rather than using the B diminished, we would probably just use A augmented. And that sounds really tense as well. Not a very nice sounding chord on its own, but in the context of a song, that can be really satisfying. And finally, we have suspended chords, or sus chords for short. That's not a joke, that's actually genuinely what we call them. Now, while I told you that chords are simply just stacked thirds, every rule has its exceptions. So, in the case of an A chord, we could have an A sus2 or an A sus4. And that just involves, rather than playing the third note of the scale in this chord, we just pick the second one, or maybe the fourth in another case. And those sound really nice. Those chords are really useful if you want to be ambiguous about a chord's tonality. Maybe you don't want the chord to feel very major or very minor. This is a good way to do that without letting the chord feel too plain or simple. It gives you a nice ambiguous feel and is kind of ethereal in a way. I don't know what term I would use to describe it. Point is, the ambiguity is nice and it allows you to achieve that without going out of scale. Now, another way to do a ambiguous chord is to just do the 1 and the 5. This is called a fifth chord. And it's pretty boring, but it can be really useful in certain circumstances. So for example, if we're playing this really low down on the piano, there we go, A1 and or A-1 and E0. If I clean this up here, that can sound really muddy down there, especially if I start adding more notes to my chord. This is going to sound pretty bad. Yeah, you don't really want that. So just keeping the notes a lot more simple for this, because the E note and the A note don't clash at all. With this fifth interval, since it doesn't have any real, like, tonal information or tonality in terms of major or minor, there's very little clash between the two. So generally, you'll hear it at very low octaves on like a piano or across instruments. And then this is actually very common on the electric guitar for a similar reason, because when you have a very distorted guitar tone, chords can get very muddy very fast. So with a distorted guitar, you're working almost exclusively with these fifth chords, where this note basically just serves to add some extra body to this root note, as opposed to giving you much harmonic information. I was going to include a whole section here about chord functions within chord progressions, but I think that some of that was kind of beyond the scope of this video. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent that I think is really important, and then kind of give you a basic rundown as to what notes kind of naturally want to lead where. So, the way I think of music is the same way you might think of a story. The whole time you're working towards a conclusion that you're aiming to be satisfying, but you don't want that route to your conclusion to be boring. Within that story, you'll probably have plot twists that will catch people off guard, keep them on their toes, and tense moments that really make the listener or the reader want to know what's going to happen next. And within that, you're likely to have some arcs that have their own build-up and conclusions without being a conclusion to the story as a whole. Now, in this regard, we can think of each loop of chords that you would have as your chord progression as an episode, where it has its own, climax and conclusion, but doesn't have to conclude that whole story. Now, even if your chord progression ends on a cliffhanger, like any television episode might, that's fine. All you need to worry about is whether you're actually providing a conclusion to that in that next progression. That's perfectly fine. It would be like an episode of a TV show where it ends on a cliffhanger and then the next episode is just completely unrelated, where you just leave that tension and it never gets resolved. That sort of thing, not really fun. So with a chord progression, we at the very least want to have a resolution to that cliffhanger somewhere in that progression. Now, where am I going with any of this? Basically, to put it in short, music is this sort of art of tension and release. Now, certain chords are going to have a lot of tension that are going to want to kind of direct the listener's ear to a particular place. There's 3 chords that provide a lot of tension. All right, so in our key of A minor, our home chord is going to be A. Pretty intuitive. There's 3 chords, like I mentioned, that naturally have a lot of tension that want to lead home to this A chord. The most obvious ones are the chord directly below. So in the context of our A chord, this naturally wants to lead towards this A. And on the flip side of that, we have this chord right above our home chord in the scale that also wants to lead home to our A. That's pretty intuitive. And one thing to note when you're doing chord progressions is that you kind of almost want to think of some of your notes as melodies rather than full chords. So for example, this is a very natural move from this E to F to E because they're so close to each other. And we can kind of hear this as the A to B to A and the C to D to C. That's why chords adjacent to each other have a lot of tension and want to resolve home, because there's sort of that natural flow where those notes are close to each other, and it's just kind of a natural way to continue from that point, if you will. Now, another chord that is a lot more kind of not out there per se, but not so intuitive into leading into this home chord is the 5. Now, by that I mean built off of the 5th note of the scale. So when we're talking about chord progressions, generally rather than saying the particular note name, we would say how it sits relative to our home chord. So in our home chord, or our home key of A minor, our 1 chord is going to be the A, and then we have the 2 chord, the 3 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord. Now our 5 chord naturally, for whatever reason, wants to resolve back down to the A. And this can be more pronounced by doing a few things. So even though we're in A minor, so one thing to note real quick, actually, is that regardless of whether you're in major or minor, these same sorts of things apply. But generally, this tension is stronger when notes within the chord are more directly wanting to lead to another note in the chord. So if I move these down, so G and B to this G and B, you see this B naturally would want to lead up to this C, and this G naturally wants to lead up to the A. Now, even though we're in minor, I might make this chord major. That's because this G sharp down here is just a piano key away from the A, which means that there's going to be that extra added tension to go home to the A. Yeah. And if I really want to push it, I can add this D note, which naturally wants to lead up to this E. So if I move this down here for reference, you see this wants to go up into the E. since we have an E in the chord, there's really no tension between this E moving to this E because it's just the same note. So by adding this seventh to the chord, it just adds that extra tension because we have this one note that still wants to go somewhere, and our ears kind of hears that as leading to the E. So that means it also just has more tension in general by being a bit of a more complex chord, so it more naturally kind of wants to push it to resolve somewhere. So that's kind of a general overview. And also, you don't have to do this exclusively for your home chord. If you want to direct the listener's ear anywhere, you can just use these same sorts of principles of the chord right below, the chord right above, or the chord that is the fifth up. One thing that's really common in something like Baroque music, for example, is almost every single chord is going to be led into by a 5 chord preceding it, because that's a very natural move. It very much wants to push your ear in a particular direction. And also in Baroque music, you'll often hear like maybe a diminished 7 chord, which, I didn't mention that earlier. You can just do a 7th chord with all minor intervals, and you get a diminished 7th chord. And as you can pretty obviously see, you have this note wanting to lead here, this note wanting to lead here, this note wanting to lead here. So very tense. We know that diminished chords are very negative. You don't want to stew on them for too long. And it really kind of pushes your ear home. And like I said, this does not need to be your home chord. This can be literally any chord in your scale. So if I wanted to go to the 4 chord, so that in this case that would be D. Let's put this here. So now I'm essentially trying to decide, how do I want to link my home note of A up to this 4? You can jump to the 4. That's not a terribly unnatural movement, but you can kind of add more energy by doing what's called a secondary dominant, which is to say just doing the 5th note of the chord you want to go to, but rather than it being the home note, it's just any other chord. So in this case, well, I guess that would be the A. So like I was just saying before, that's a pretty natural move, I suppose. Let's pick a better example. Hell, I could say I want to go to that 5 chord from my home chord. And let's say I want to use that 5 chord to resolve back to my 1. So now it's just a matter of determining, how do I want to get to the 5 chord? I can use the secondary dominant of that. So this is a very, very natural chord progression because, like I was saying, this chord naturally wants to kind of go to a B the same way the B wants to go to the A, in the sense that it's an adjacent chord. So it's a very natural move. And then we're going from this B, which is serving as this 5th chord or 5 chord, to the E. That feels a bit out there. It's way too high up. Let me invert this, and I think that'll sound more natural. There we go. And now we have a chord progression. Now, there's other chords that have like different functions. Like, for example, I would say some of your weaker chords, for example, would be something like this. So A to C major, which shares 2 notes, and the only real tension is from this G wanting to go to the A. It's not a super tense move. Like, it's a little not dead per se, but you don't have a whole lot of tension there. And you can do this move. I do this sort of stuff frequently, but it's kind of nice to know which chords have the most tension, because you can really use those to justify moving almost anywhere you want. You can do a chord out of scale, and you can justify that by using the fifth or an adjacent chord. It just is a much more natural move than, you know, me jumping from, like, I don't know, this is probably gonna sound, let's do this. Yeah, this is gonna be a really out there change. None of these notes are in scale, so very, very strong clash there. Sometimes that's what you want. You do that a lot in metal music, this sort of movement, but it's easier to digest as a listener sometimes when you're justifying some of those moves. And sometimes it's not just because the chord is out of scale. Sometimes it's just a very complicated, dense chord that maybe draws some notes out of scale, and you can sort of soften it by making that transition to that chord feel as natural as possible. Anyway, I don't know if I explained that last part of this particularly well, since that was more off the cuff, but I hope that you found this helpful.